For packet 3, the standards are A1A, A1B, A1C. This is a supporting category. It describes independent and dependent quantities, and you're supposed to gather and record data and use that data to determine functional relationships. So again, functions will be on a video that's to follow. It's right below on your cover sheet. It's A103, and it's over functions. And that's going to go in talking about what makes things a function, how can I tell from a graph, how can I tell from a table, and those types of things. So make sure you watch that video to really get that aspect of this packet. But what I don't have on there is independent and dependent and how we tell those apart. And so that's what I'm going to go over on this video. So the questions that were on the EOC last year, 35, 32, and 4. Number 32 addresses if it's a function or not, and number 4 is really addressing, making inequalities or making equations. And so again, that's going to be on the videos to follow. So 35 is going to be the one that I talk about here. The question says, a print shop charges a fixed amount per photocopy and gives 10% discount off the total cost of photocopies. The total cost is a function of the number of photocopies made. What is the independent quantity in this situation? Well, before I can answer this question, I have to know what is independent and what is dependent. Independent and dependent. X is your independent, Y is your dependent. Another way to say this is X is your input, Y is your output. I like to think of it that X has 2 legs so it can stand on its own, and Y just has 1 leg, and so it needs to lean on somebody. So X is your independent, Y is dependent. Another way, like I said, is whatever is in the problem, which is going to be right over here, is your X, is your independent. And whatever the answer is, or your output, is your Y, which is also your dependent value. So whatever's in the problem is independent, and what is the answer is dependent. So those are also good ways to know how to distinguish the. But if I look, I can also fill out a sentence, and I use blank depends on blank. That means that this value is going to be, when it says blank depends on, it's going to be the dependent or the Y on blank. So it depends on your X or your independent value. So it's very important to know which blank describes what. So now we just fill it in. Blank depends on blank. So if I look at my first example, time and money, does the amount of money I make depend on the time that I work, or does the time I work depend on how much money I make? Well, it's the first way. The amount of money that I make depends on how much time I put into it. So if this depends on time, that means this is your dependent, which is your Y, and that time would be your X or your independent. Let's look at our next example. Study time compared to your grade. Okay, does your study time depend on your grade? Or does your grade depend on how much time you put into studying? Well, it's the grade depends on how much time you put on studying. So that would be your Y. And so study time would be independent, which is your X. What about hours worked and money made? Okay, it's kind of just like this one up here. The time that you spent working and the money that you make. The money depends. So this would be your Y on the hours that you work, which would be your X. You can also look at equations, like I was saying earlier. So whatever is in the equation would be your independent, so time. And whatever the output is, right here, would be your dependent value, so distance. So again, I can look at an equation and tell you what is independent and dependent. I can look at a word problem by making my sentence blank depends on blank. And all of those different ways are going to help me figure out what's independent and dependent. And there will be questions like that on the EOC. The last way that you might also be asked to find if something's independent and dependent is from a graph. And this way is really the easiest way because it tells me what my x-axis is and what my y-axis is. X is always independent, y is always dependent. And so that tells me right there. Whatever's on my x-axis is going to be my independent. Whatever's on my y-axis would be my dependent. And so this time the clothes wash depends on the number of loads that I do of laundry. And so again, I can fill out my sentence, but I don't need to because I've got an x and y axis, and that tells me independent and dependent right there.